It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Misfits. We are here with Reverend Joel Bowman Sr., one of our favorite guests. We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of off-air conversations, both of us venting about the same things, just in a different setting. And today we are actually going to go ahead and take one of those things we've been venting about over text. And one of the things that Joel has already written about and published here over the past couple of weeks. And we are going to dive into a topic that he was asking for me to cover with him because he's been waiting for somebody to be able to actually talk about it with him. So, one disclaimer before we start so we can get the trolls out of our mentions already is that what we are talking about today is not a political commentary, it's a theological commentary on current political events. And that's an important distinction because we already know what the criticisms from both sides are going to be after this airs. So we want to just lay it all flat out now. Anybody that knows either one of us in any kind of a professional setting knows we talk theology, we don't talk politics. And so that's what we're going to do today. Now, what is this big scary thing that we have to disclaimer? If you have not seen American news over the past, 6 months, you may not be aware that a former president has been indicted multiple times and now has even had a mugshot taken in the state of Georgia, along with a lot of other people that have been supporting him for a while, including one pastor. Obviously, if you don't know from that, you're not an American, because we're obviously talking about the whole saga related to Donald Trump and all of these indictments. Now, we are going to look at this, like we said, from a theological point of view, because one of the things that basically anybody that is a part of evangelicalism or has ever been a part of evangelicalism within America, especially white evangelicalism, saw how the Donald Trump saga beginning in 2015 shined a massive light on the theological, specifically the Cold War theological and the slaveholder theological issues within white evangelicalism. Some of us, it was just a confirmation that it's there, and they've been calling it out for years. Dr. Bowman's one that's been calling there I go again. I just called you doctor again. Pastor Joel is one of those that's been calling this out for a long time. I started calling it out in 2015, right before a lot of other people were starting to call it out. But there has been a massive light shown on major theological, I was about to say faux pas, but I guess actually just heresies in a lot of ways, and idolatries within white evangelicalism in the United States. So, Joel, you've written an article in the Baptist News Global. You've written a lot of articles, including one that just released today as we're recording this, which that will also, if you haven't checked any of the Misfits social media at all today, you may have missed it. So go look back to August 28th, and you'll be able to find his article there. But you wrote an article a couple weeks ago specifically highlighting how the Trump indictment saga has shown in a lot of ways the ever-increasing demise within evangelicalism. That's part of what we want to discuss today, is a lot of the things that you highlighted there. One of the big pieces you highlighted was morality and hypocrisy and conspiracy within this sort of faith culture. So let's walk through that a little bit, because you talked about the hypocrisy of a law and order president now being lawless. That's the easy one. But then you said there were a lot of other areas that you said we should be concerned with related to morality and hypocrisy and conspiracy. So why is it that you made the argument that for us in the church especially, the concerns should definitely be about the morality of the situation more than just the blatant hypocrisy of the situation. Why is the morality the big key here?
Well, the morality is a big key simply because God calls us as believers to be holy. You know, be holy for I am holy. All right. So we know that biblical axiom, that biblical instruction, that we are to model for the world or behavior is all about. But that's where the hypocrisy comes in that some of the Christians who shout the loudest about moral piety have shown their hypocrisy. And I think you and I have talked about this before in terms of back in the 90s, the white evangelical church writ large was talking a lot about how character mattered. And in particular, they were talking about that in reference to one Bill Clinton, our former president. And when he got caught up in his moral crises, if you would, there were so many people who were saying that he was automatically disqualified for leadership. But then when you fast forward to 2015, 2016, that's situational ethic is what I call it, because it worked in the first situation with Bill Clinton, but all of a sudden, white evangelicals in their hypocrisy gave Donald Trump a mulligan. They gave him a mulligan as if to say, well, we're voting for a president, not a pastor, right? That we know that God can use imperfect people and that we are primarily focused on his policies and we can separate the policies from the person. And so we began to really see the hypocrisy, glaring hypocrisy in front of us all, those of us who had the discernment to see it as Trump rose to power in 2015 and 2016.
You know, the other thing that you highlight later on in the article that we're going to get more in depth with, but part of what you also highlighted is the fact that the argument was always, well, we're just focused on his policy, not the character.
Right.
But his policies were not necessarily ones that lined up with what we would expect for a party crying for morality either. Especially for us as believers when we get to things like the Imago Dei.
Right.
Why do you think, you know, you and I have had this discussion multiple times in other settings. Why is it that we have selective morality? You know, we talked about selective hypocrisy, but why does it seem like when it comes to politics especially and power plays and power dynamics, why is it that we suddenly seem to have selective morality on top of the selective hypocrisy?
Simply because, contrary to what has been portrayed in the past, I believe that white evangelicalism is not primarily focused on certain theological essentials or the Bevington quadrilateral. It is primarily focused on political power. And we've seen the clear evidence of that, that even though the profession is that, you know, we as evangelicals are focused on this, it has been revealed over time that political power is really of preeminent importance to these individuals.
So, you know, this actually gets us into the next section a little bit, because, you know, the main thing we were originally planning on looking at with all this was this idea of law and order within theology, as far as a theology of law and order. But I think the first place we actually need to go with this that leads into the law and order is what you just described, for what this theology of power. You know, what is it? I guess the bigger question, do you think there's something inherent about the way that white theology especially is more inclined to go towards the abusive theologies and abuses of power, more so than even than other ethnic styles of theology and identity and everything else. Why? What is
Well,
it exactly that drives this?
right. Well, I would say, Andrew, that it's all about white supremacy. So when I look at the history of the American Christian church, and specifically the evangelical church, you cannot talk about the same without referring to white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because from the very beginning of Christianity in America, it was tainted by white supremacy. It was tainted by the grabbing of power, the grabbing of land. You know, you have the whole manifest destiny. You have this whole discovery theory that basically persons of European descent could lay claim
Mm-hmm.
of land that did not belong to them. And so all of that has been mixed in with the theology so as to pollute it and dilute it. And so I believe that white evangelicals in particular are prone to that because much of the theology, the underlying theology, is rooted in empire, it is rooted in power. And it's unfortunate because, you know, Jesus says that my kingdom is not of this world. But white evangelicals who pride themselves on the belief in the inerrancy of Scripture and the sufficiency of the gospel and what Jesus did, it is unfortunate that they have been drawn into, they have been sucked into the quest for political power.
Mm-hmm.
And that quest for political power has, as it were, trumped any theological integrity.
The key thing you said there is they've been sucked into it. Because, you know, this is one of the things we highlight a lot within the stuff that we talk about on here, is that for many people, the unfortunate side is that it's not even something where they necessarily are theologically heretical. They are victims of heretical teaching that has been a part of the system for so long.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we talk about systemic racism within the church, a big piece of the systemic racism within the church is a systemic theological error that has perpetrated it, which is different than when we talk about systemic racism within a nation.
That's right.
There,
That's
it's
right.
one that is, yeah. So how do we then go about addressing these sort of things, especially when we get to this idea of law and order? Because this is where you really dialed in for this article you wrote. And this really is where a lot of these other things are dialed in as well, even within the media right now. You know, when we talk about power, it's very easy for everybody to say, oh yeah, power and pride are not good. We don't want those as Christians. Most people, if they are being honest, are going to be able to say, yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing this. Even if they're drawn in by the big speeches and everything else, when it boils down to it, if you say, is Jesus all about your personal power, they're going to say no. They may not act that way. They may not preach that on Sunday morning, but that is what, when it boils down to it, they know that. But when we get to things like law and order, things get to be a little bit more, I guess, actually a little bit less nuanced in the way that we approach it, especially as Americans. So let's walk through a little bit why. Actually, let's start with this question first, which I realize I didn't actually put on your list of questions, but we'll just run with it. Why is it that we as Americans are drawn to law and order? Why do you think we as Americans are drawn to law and order?
Well, I think what we need to do is reframe the question and ask why it is that white Americans primarily are drawn to law and order. It's because of the history of slavery. It's because of the slave patrols that had arisen in the state of South Carolina in the 1700s. Law and order is merely a euphemism for power and control. You know, when
Mm.
you look at law and order politics, you know, starting from Nixon, Barry Goldwater, on up through Ronald Reagan and now Donald Trump, when you look at how law and order is utilized, you have to ask yourself the question, law and order for whom?
Right.
And is that law and order being equally applied to all people across the board? And the answer to that question is simply, it never has been, nor
Right.
was it intended to be. Okay. And that's where we're seeing the hypocrisy, who oftentimes would say, I'm the president of law and order. I am the one who is going to make sure we get all of these cities under control, et cetera, et cetera. And mind you, in the midst of all that, he's using dog whistles, because
Hmm.
whenever he uses the term big city or inner city, that is a euphemism or brown. Okay. And so when politicians on the right have spoken of law and order, it has always been code language for how can we exert power and control over racially marginalized people, poor white people as
Yes.
well.
And this is something that Joe and I just talked about with last week's episode when we talked about the draw to capitalism within
Mm-hmm.
American society, is that it's one of those things where we talk about these things in the terms that it's always talked about. So we talk about it as capitalism, we talk about it as law and order, but in
Mm-hmm.
reality, what we're talking about is we're talking about exploitation, and we are talking
Mm-hmm.
about power and control over those that we have
Right.
exploited.
That's right. Exactly right. When you look at slavery, you cannot talk about the evils of slavery without talking about capitalism. And you
Mm-hmm.
can't talk about capitalism without talking about law and order. All of them are connected in some way.
And the thing that has kind of surprised me the most with why we have such a desire to see law and order in terms of the way that it's talked about is that
Hmm.
the same people that are always law and order, law and order, law and order
Hmm.
are the ones that claim to be the party of the founders,
Hmm.
who were not about law and order. They were about throwing the tea in the harbor. They were about
Hmm.
revolting against the person that they saw as a threat. They were,
Yep. The
and
American
yet we,
Revolution.
and yet we now, and even when we talk about the American dream and everything else, we're talking about going and making it big despite what society tells you you can be, despite all these different things. But then when we start to get into actually applying it, suddenly then it's all about law and order, law and order, law and order.
Right.
And the bigger
Right.
thing for us as believers is why law and order suddenly becomes a rallying cry within the church, when part of what we talk about as believers is the fact that we are no longer subject to the law. Now, granted, and again, before the trolls come at us, we're not saying that the law of the nation is the same as the law of the of the Old Testament and the law that we talk about within the Gospels.
Hmm.
But what we are saying is
Hmm.
that it's very interesting to see why law and order becomes such a big cry for those of us that say we are free from the law, and we see what kind of freedom
Right.
actually comes from not being under the law.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
Pastor Joel, I want to ask you this question: for what does Scripture actually tell us about law and order? How are we actually supposed to look at this theologically when we talk about law and order in relation to the government law and order, and not the law and order of the New Testament? We're talking law and order with the government. What does Scripture actually tell us we should be doing?
Well, Jesus says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and render unto. So there is a place for the rule of law. There is a place for laws that are designed to provide boundaries and restrictions. But that should be ultimately for the good, not just for the good of white people or the good of a particular segment of society, if we want to talk about law and order in its pure sense, that it needs to be focused on the love neighbor. It needs to be focused on respect for every image bearer, that every human being bears the image and likeness of God. And so I think we get it twisted a lot of times, and we sometimes will superimpose man's law on the God's law as if man's law is more important. But we're taught in Scripture that our citizenship is in heaven, right? And that ultimately our allegiance is to God's law, his precepts and principles that are fleshed out in Scripture. And of course, in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, we see the law of love. We see the law of Christ being focused upon, which is rooted in love. It is rooted in a love for and a respect for one's neighbor. But unfortunately, when politicians talk about law and order, oftentimes they're talking about selecting certain people in society that are deemed to be undesirable and somehow exerting power and control over said individuals. And that's why you have a situation where you've got Trump and others on the right who they look at the persons on January 6th who were insurrectionists and they call them patriots. But yet they look at racial justice protesters who are protesting peacefully. And for instance, Colin Kaepernick is one of the ones that Trump referred to as an SOB. So you see the disconnect there.
And even the article you just wrote, related to the legacy of Dr. King. For, the majority of his life, he was labeled as a troublemaker and a rebel and a communist and all these other things.
Right.
And yet he, for the most part, was doing things within the law, even when he was protesting the law. But because of what laws he was protesting. Right.
He was exercising his First Amendment rights. And there's a lot of emphasis today on First Amendment rights. And I think sometimes they're used as a shield for bad behavior, and not just bad behavior, in many cases, illegal behavior. Okay.
Right. And hateful behavior. Even if they're not going to classify as illegal, it is hateful behavior. I mean, that's anybody that has been on Twitter since the rebrand knows that as soon as the freedom of speech filters were removed, suddenly almost every other mention is somebody spouting off either slaveholder theology or anti-Semitism or any, insert any type of hate speech here. And they're saying, no, I can do this because freedom of speech, First Amendment.
Right. Yeah. And it's sad that we have seen just within the last 48 hours, Andrew, how vitriolic rhetoric can sometimes feed a person who's already radicalized, or maybe there's some mental health issues, and they go and they commit white supremacy violence and murder 3 African Americans there in Jacksonville, Florida. I think that you can draw a straight line from a certain vitriolic rhetoric from the right to these violent episodes. We can see that there's a direct connection between the two. And I was saying this way back in 2015 when Trump brought this type of language into vogue. Basically, I was warning people. I said, if this continues, there are going to be people who actually carry out what Trump is talking about. And here we are 7 years later, and we're seeing the fruit of that vitriolic and racist rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. And that, yeah, 2015, I believe, is when I had made the statement also, the fact that if he was ever elected, that he was never going to give up power peacefully, because the rhetoric doesn't allow for that. Because again, law and order is power and control. Whether it's over one group of people or whether it's over the entire country, that mindset cannot let go. Now, this is the bigger question related to all of that, and it's actually it's related to what we were just talking about. When we talk about law and order, first we're going to ask the question about when we talk about law and order as a church in the U.S. today, when we're hearing people talk about law and order. So mainly white evangelicalism. Is the law and order they're talking about morality, is it about society, or is it about power structures?
There are some that use that verbiage, and they are well-intentioned, and they are thinking first and foremost about public safety, but they don't understand the historical context, the nuance in terms of how the phrase has been used throughout history. And so it is possible that people could be utilizing that language with good intentions, but because of our historical context, the language is doing something in society, right? It is exploiting people's biases. You know, you have individuals who have a bias, who have a misconception that persons of African descent are inherently more criminal, or they're inherently less moral than whites. And so all of that is poured into law and order. But a lot of people, because of their ignorance and naivete, they don't understand that just by using that phrase in that way is perpetuating the systemic racism. It is perpetuating power structures. It is perpetuating the status quo remaining. And so we have to understand that, you could use language with good intentions, but do serious damage.
And that last piece is where I typically go when this kind of question comes up as well, or because the argument we hear, and I just had like 5 or 6 people trying to make this argument about Christian nationalism just in the past 24 hours, is this idea of that Christian nationalism is about retaining morality through law and order, which is what God wants for us. And typically they go to Romans 13 and throw a bunch of craziness out that shows they haven't actually read the chapter. But what we end up finding, if we dig deep enough and ask the right questions, is that what they are considering to be morality is not actually what Scripture defines as morality. What they're identifying as morality is simply just the power structures that are holding them up as an individual. It's not, when this is part of why we're having this discussion and why everybody needs to go read the article that's linked in here from Pastor Bowman from a few weeks ago about this sort of thing. Is that when we talk about law and order and we talk about morality and we talk about hypocrisy, they are much more tied together than most people are going to give credit to. Because the morality that is talked about within the political side of law and order is not biblical morality.
Not biblical morality, no.
And the law and order that is talked about in Scripture is one, like Pastor Bowman already said, is tied directly into love thy neighbor, which is ultimately where we understand what morality is about. This is why when we look at the Hebrew words for justice, righteousness is the first word that comes up with it.
That's right.
Because justice is what morality is actually about.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
I think that it's been well said that Justice is what love looks like in public.
Hmm.
Yeah. Justice is what love looks like in public. I believe that was Cornel West who said that.
Sounds like it would be him.
Hmm.
That sounds like it's in his playbook. So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what this actually shows us, as what it shows about us as a church, both in terms of America as a whole, as well as within white evangelicalism as a whole, and what we need to do about all of this. So we'll be right back after this break.
We'll be right back.
What's up, everybody? Joe here from Buddy Walk with Jesus. Buddy Walk with Jesus is a show designed to delve deep into the intimate reality of God's present kingdom through raw and honest conversations. And I'd like to invite you guys to join us as we continue on our journey through the book of Matthew. Whether you start from the beginning or jump in at the latest episode, we'd love to have you along for the ride as we seek to unpack the heart of God through the personhood of Jesus. You can find Buddy Walk with Jesus anywhere where you can find podcasts, including our newest home over on YouTube Podcasts. You can also head on over to facebook.com/buddywalkwithjesus. Engage with me over there, as well as our community group at the Buddy Walk community. Remember two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. Peace, y'all.
Today's a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your online reach.
Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online listened on all major platforms within minutes of finishing your first recording. We just switched to Buzzsprout for Season 2 and have immediately noticed the difference.
With Buzzsprout, you get a great-looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into your websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and Buzzsprout and the Misfits want to help you get started.
Contact us for a free consultation call, and then visit our affiliate link to get started with Buzzsprout. Using this link not only helps support the Misfits, but it also gets you a $20 Amazon gift card. The teams at Buzzsprout and Ministry Misfits are passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. To find out more, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/affiliates.
We're back.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I'm still here with Pastor Joel Bowman. We are walking through hot water today, more so than even normal. And if you want to blame somebody for why we're doing it, you can actually blame our guest, because this was his idea. So, and he's proudly claiming that it was his idea. So part of why we're doing this with him, though, is because he had written an article in the Baptist News Global a few weeks ago at this point, talking about how the Trump indictment saga relates to evangelicalism especially, but the American church as a whole, and where our priorities are, and how we look at things like law and order and morality and hypocrisy. And we've talked a little bit about all three of those things. But now we're going to actually get into more of why he says that this is really a giant magnifying glass into what is actually going on under the surface. So we're going to talk now about what all of this actually shows us about us as a church. And when we talk about that, the first place we're looking is mainly we are talking about white evangelicalism, unfortunately, because that is where the majority of the rhetoric talk around this stuff is coming out of from the church.
Mm-hmm.
But we also are going to be looking at this from just American church culture in general, which doesn't necessarily have any kind of racial bias or racial bounds to it, just simply by the fact that we all are in the same region of the world and everything else. So we're going to look at this kind of in two different areas. It should be very easy to see which area we're talking about at any given time. But we want to just make sure we're clear on our terms before we get going into this. So, the main thing that this shows us as a church that you were talking about in your article, we talk about all the time, dealing with the Cold War theology stuff, dealing with the capitalist Christianity stuff, is that it shows us our cultural priorities as church in general, big C church. So we started asking the question, but now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this of why is it that culturally we go towards, or we are more likely to go towards law and order as a theology, more so than going towards things like, dissidents, things like protests, things like all these different things. Why are we more inclined to sit back and say law and order than to actually get our hands dirty and actually do the work of what we talked about before the break of justice and righteousness within our society and dealing with things like the systemic structures of power?
Well, I think it's primarily because there is a desire to maintain social order. And, we live in a racialized society, let's face it, in which white people, particularly white males, are at the top of the racial hierarchy, and black people are at the very bottom. And the law and order rhetoric is largely designed and intended to perpetuate that notion that in society, all of us have these fixed castes, if you would, that we are supposed to remain in. And historically, when you look at American history, anyone that has challenged that, be it Dr. King or other individuals in the civil rights movement, they were persecuted for having the audacity to give a critical analysis of the social order and to talk about the Imago Dei, talk about the fact that, we are equally created in God's image, and therefore all of us are to be treated as persons with inherent worth and dignity. Because law and order is all about the empowerment of a certain group of people and the continued oppression of another group of people, right? That cannot be lost on us. That when we look at how the rhetoric has been marshaled by politicians and pundits and other persons in power, it has always been about keeping certain people in their place. And the moment that they begin to leave their place, if you will, then all of a sudden they deserve to be called SOBs, as Trump did with Colin Kaepernick and the other individuals in the NFL who had knelt in protest. But if the shoe is on the other foot, as we said earlier, i.e. January 6th, then all of a sudden there are people coming to the defense of these individuals, calling them patriots and saying that they were merely exercising their First Amendment rights. But you and I both know that 5 individuals died as a result of that insurrection. And there were over 140 police officers. There we go. Over 140 police officers were injured. Some of them were so incredibly maimed that they can no longer serve in law enforcement. And the irony of all of this is that the very people who were inflicting the damage on these bodies were the very people crying law and order, were the very people who often talked about certain individuals or certain elements in society being kept in check. But all of a sudden, they weren't so pro-police when they were beating them literally with American flagpoles.
Right.
And so,
And that's just
that hypocrisy.
right. And that's just
Yeah.
on the law side. The other thing that people forget when we talk law and order is that there's the order side to it also. And the thing that they were protesting was an orderly transition of power.
Orderly transition of power. Yep.
And so you know, this is part of where when we get into the hypocrisy side of it, is that it's hypocrisy multiple times over. And that's not even just related to what we're dealing with within the church. Outside of the fact, because this is, I already know, we're going to get the comments of, well, the church does, nobody in the church actually talks about it this way. Nobody is talking about law and order in terms of a racial diagram or keeping society racialized or anything like that. But yet, just in the past week, I've seen at least 2 well-known pastors make the statement that the church needs to be talking about from the pulpit what happens when white people are no longer the majority. Because suddenly minority situations matter to them when suddenly they think that they're no longer going to be the majority. And this was not asked in a hypothetical, like, maybe this should make you think about the way we talk about these things. That is one area of it where that's a teaching tool of let's change the dynamic a little bit. What if you were in that situation? That's empathy. That's not what is the way that this discussion is going down. It is instead of a, like you said earlier, a dog whistle, a warning, a rallying cry of, if we don't do something, we are not going to have our power anymore.
Power. It's about power. Yeah, and you know, not only is it about power, but it's also about the animating force of fear.
Yes.
You know, fear is driving a lot of this. You know, what I find is that particularly when a lot of white males who are gun enthusiasts and they're very much into, you know, these are my Second Amendment rights and they can't take my guns away, etc. And then they try to sacralize it as if the Second Amendment is in the Bible, right? They put God or Jesus's name on it. But really, if you peel back the layers, a lot of it has to do with fear.
Yes.
You know, fear of the other, you know, the fear that the other is going to come and take my stuff, take my material possessions. Right.
And that's also part of where, you know, one of the things I was going to ask you, because obviously we know, anybody that has studied American history knows the racial side. Well, anybody that has actually studied actual American history. We need to actually clarify that now, unfortunately.
Yes, not David Barton, not David Barton, but actual American history.
Knows that there's a racial divide. But there's another side of this when we talk about the church. How much of this do you think is also affected by the fear of persecution and the fear of Christianity no longer being the status quo culturally?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you would use the term persecution because there's a difference between how the early Christians were persecuted in biblical antiquity versus what a lot of white evangelicals call persecution.
100%. Yeah.
Understand, we don't live in a theocracy, right? America is not the new Israel. We're not governed by Old Testament law. We're not, you know, America's not the shining city on a hill, as Reagan talked about. Right. Jesus was referring to his disciples being that. All right. But I think a lot of times what happens is that we as Christians have been fooled into thinking that we can't peacefully coexist with others in a pluralistic society.
Exactly.
You know, this is a a democratic republic. It is a pluralistic society in which not everyone is a Christian. Okay. Now, obviously, I would love for everyone to be a Christian simply because I believe that Jesus saves. But not all individuals in this society subscribe to that particular theology. And so we cannot live out the Christian life as if we are supposed to impose our personal values on how government is run. Okay. Because then you get into questions of, okay, if America is a so-called Christian nation, what kind of Christian nation is it? You know,
Right.
Is it Protestant? Is it Catholic? Is it Baptist? Is it Pentecostal? Is it Arminian? Is it Reformed? Right.
Well, now we're into the
America,
conditional morality now. You know, we're now into the other side of all this as far as conditional morality, because part of what you hear among people calling for America to be a Christian nation again is purely related to sexual morality that they deem to be a problem. It's about
right, right,
it's all about that, or it's about abortion and nothing else.
right.
But if
Those two issues.
yeah, if we talk about morality in terms of things that Jesus talked about in terms of selling all you have and feed and give to the poor,
Right.
or sacrifice yourself for the good of others, or give
Mm-hmm.
more than people ask of you, or
Mm-hmm.
even the idea of live peacefully with others, be blessed
Mm-hmm.
are the peacemakers. Suddenly, that is not part of the morality conversation anymore. Instead, that is labeled as softness or Marxist or watered down Jesus,
Or
because
woke.
the only or woke, because the only Jesus they actually see
Mm-hmm.
and respect is the white Jesus that flips tables.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting how when we talk about morality in the church, oftentimes what gets lost is in the book of Matthew, Jesus talked about the weightier matters, right?
Right.
Justice, mercy, and faith, right? And that's not to say, can I as a Christian have a particular understanding of sexual ethics? Of course I can. I do. Can I, as a Christian, have a particular ethic as it relates to life? Yes. But it must go far beyond the GOP party platform, right?
Mm-hmm.
It cannot be limited to the issue of sexual morality or the issue of abortion. And it's interesting how some of the same people who are talking about how America is going to hell in terms of the lack of sexual morality, some of those same people are guilty of sexual immorality themselves. It's just easier to hide and perhaps more socially acceptable.
A large portion of what we've been talking about as a whole, related to morality, related to hypocrisy, which you just went straight into the hypocrisy right off the bat. What you talked about in terms of the weightier matters that Jesus talks about.
Mm-hmm.
This was not some original thought of Jesus's right there in the moment. Now we can get all theologically, it was an original thought of Jesus's, but he literally is quoting Micah chapter 6.
Yeah.
Because the things that God says is required of his nation is love, God, justice, mercy, and faith.
And walk humbly. Mm-hmm.
Those have always been the things that were the weightier matters.
Right. Right.
What has happened...
But see, the Pharisees...
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened within our culture is that due to the way that we started, and so this is why, we keep flashing the Cold War theology stuff on the screen. This is part of what, Dr. Bowman talked about Reagan's wording for this, but it goes back to John Winthrop even further back, of this idea of the shining city on the hill and everything else. Everything about the way this nation was founded was about conditional morality.
Mm-hmm.
The Puritans came to escape judgment in England and in Holland But then when they got here, they then imposed the same thing that they ran from on other people.
Right.
They claimed to be coming for religious reasons, but yet then while they were here, they made their money chaplaining slave ships.
Yes.
Those that want to claim
Yes.
law and order because of the fact that the U.S. is built on biblical morality and biblical law ignore the fact that the U.S. Constitution still denies the Imago Dei today. Because if you look at Article 1, Section 2, the Three-Fifths Compromise still is in print. And it took a long time and a lot of bloodshed for it to be amended to correct that. And even when they corrected it, they still didn't correct it because of the exception clause. And now we have a new reason for law and order. This is why this whole thing matters so much for us as believers within the U.S., especially, is that when we are seen parading around as our, in some cases, I've actually seen people actually call him their Messiah, as somebody that is the law and order president, that somebody is all those things, and yet he himself is arrested for lawlessness and disorder. How do you think anybody is ever going to take you seriously when you talk about the fact that your king is the King of Kings and that is actually a God of order and that frees us from the oppression of the law and calls us into the reality of his law, which is justice and love and faith and mercy? And this is really where, at least for me, what I got out of your article, why morality and hypocrisy and law and order all were thrown together, is that the hypocrisy of the law and order impacts the way we view morality, and it impacts the morality of even how we go about our mission here within this nation. So
yeah.
Any closing? Well, oh no, that's right. Sorry, I forgot. We've got one other big point, and we've kind of hit on it, but it has to be talked about, especially in light of recent events. So we are recording this on Monday, August 28th. We're what is it? Has it been 24 hours or has it been 36 hours?
Probably closer to 36.
Yeah. So just in the past 2 days, there's been another racial shooting, and this time there's no doubt it was a racial shooting due to the fact of, the guy came in with Nazi paraphernalia on his weapon. 3 image bearers of color died.
They were massacred. They were massacred. I think we need to state that emphatically. They didn't just die. Right. But yeah.
How can, because you asked the question on Twitter and on Facebook as far as what do white Christians say we need to do now that we've seen this again? How are we supposed to actually react to all of this? In relation to the discussion today, in dealing with the idea of law and order and the fact that people are I've already seen people trying to excuse the shooting as just mental health.
That's the biggest cop-out.
Yeah.
Biggest cop-out. Yeah.
How can we go about dealing, how can we unfortunately use the situation that we're in right now to try and correct the ship in the way that we as a church, especially as a white church, deal with things like law and order, especially with what we've talked about today, how often law and order is just code for systemic racism.
Yeah. So I think it's quite revealing, and it's an instructional tool whenever a Black image bearer is unjustly taken from us. Because then you see sometimes the strange silence of white evangelicals and other white Christians, that they're very selective in terms of what they decide to address from the pulpit, what they decide to address in their interpersonal contacts. That, when it comes to Black or brown image bearers being taken from us, unjustly, there's oftentimes a strange silence. So whether that meant for George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or for these three individuals who were gunned down in Jacksonville, Florida, there's a selective morality or a conditional morality that is employed. And it's interesting to me how, for instance, I'll give you this example. Philando Castile, who several years ago was pulled over, he and his girlfriend's baby girl, and he announces very assertively to the police officer, look, I'm a licensed gun owner and my firearm is here in the vehicle. And he did all the so-called right things to submit to the established order. And what happens to Philando Castile? He's murdered. And I'm going to use the term murder, even though it was not found to be legally, but morally, I believe it was murder. And ironically, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, rather than coming out and vehemently speaking against this act that was perpetrated upon this black man by the police officer, they remained silent and simply said, well, let all the facts come out.
So part of what you were talking about with all of that is the idea that the selective silence on top of the selective morality related to all of this. So which do you think is actually more harmful? The selective silence or the rhetoric that gets defended as free speech when we all know it's not? Which one is actually more harmful, especially coming out of the church when these sort of events happen?
I would say that selective silence is more deadly. It's more dangerous. We've heard the quotes that go something like this, that if good men sit silently and allow evil men to do whatever they're going to do, that's a shame for the so-called good men. And the same principle applies to the Christian, that we do not have the luxury to merely sit in silence. Andrew, there are sins of commission and sins of omission, and many of us have remained silent when we should have spoken up. And in every generation of American history, there have been Christians who have been complicit by virtue of their silence, right? The same thing happened when the Nazi regime popped up in Germany. All of the Christians, most of them were in support of that regime. And many of them remained silent as fellow image bearers were being demoralized.
Yeah, it's and this is part of why, specifically going into what you just talked about as far as Germany in the 1920s and 30s. This is why this discussion is so important for us today here in the US, is that law and order was the cry. And specifically, even though people will try to deny it, the initial cry coming out of the Third Reich was that this was a Christian movement. We have morality on our side. We have law and order. We have morality on our side. And outside of select few like Bonhoeffer and others, there was a resistance movement that stayed true to doing what the letter of the law, what Jesus calls the letter of the law, actually says, which was caring about our neighbor more than the laws that are created to hold them down. So, Pastor Bowman, we got to cut this one short. I'm sure we'll continue this discussion either on air or off air at some point. because there's
Definitely.
always going to be something that's going to make both of our heads spin at the same time coming out of the news. So in the meantime, if you want to check out any of his other writings besides what is already linked, you can do so at acompellingvoice.com. That's all one word, acompellingvoice.com. All of his writings are there, as well as links to different interviews he's done, including other Misfits episodes that he's been on and doing. You also can check him out next week. He'll be back not as Pastor Joel Bowman, but as Joe Bowman, LCSW. We're going to be talking mental health. Most likely, some of the same things we just talked about are going to show up in that conversation as well. That's unfortunately just the nature of the beast at the moment. But you can check that out. Also, for Patreon listeners, be on the lookout in the next week or two. There will also be a special episode on Patreon exclusive to you from Bowman here, dealing with both hats that he wears as pastor and as a mental health worker. And unfortunately, again, dealing with some of the stuff we talked about today, talking about gun violence specifically. So in the meantime, if you want to join up for Patreon for that, patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. You can support us there. I believe for extra episodes, it's the $10 level, but even at the $3 level, you get access to some different goodies, different merchandise, things like that. If you want more information about anything else related to what we're doing, ministrymisfits.com. As I said, unfortunately, it's looking like we are not going to be able to do fantasy football this year. There's been some family emergencies that have come up, and so I don't think I'm going to have time to get any of that ready. But if you still want to give to TICVA, be prepared, because in November, month of giving is coming up, and all money that we raise in November is going to do the work there at TICVA still. So, Pastor Bowman, thank you for doing this. Thank you for suggesting this. Thank you for forcing this on me, however we want to really word it. Again, go check out his stuff, and we will see the rest of you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.